welcome everybody, and I just maybe go straight into introducing the speakers. So they've already sort of said who they are. We're going to start off with the Social Change Initiative reps, that's Avila, Kilmurray, and then Martin O'Brien. And Martin and Avila have worked on both All Ireland, cross-border, the North, and internationally to promote human rights and equality and social change over many, many years and many decades actually at this point. I'd like to start maybe by asking Avila, if you could just talk to us a little bit about the experiences in the North in relation to COVID. Sorry, I'm blocking my screen now. And about the concerns and activities of people who are working in local communities in particular during the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Nuala. And actually, the Social Change Initiative, working with the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland and actually the St. Stephen's Green Trust, we did over the past 18 months 2 exercises in capturing the stories of people working at that community level on the COVID situation. And that was actually, we did that very intentionally because our sense was in the first couple of months, everybody's saying nothing can ever be the same again. And then, you know, we all realized, oh, yes, it can. Things can very quickly go back to being the same again. So it was to get some of those stories. And what came across, I think, was quite a distinction between the experience at community level and the experience, I suppose, at the more statutory or even the voluntary sector level, to be honest. I mean, it was people within local communities that were doing the door-to-door deliveries, were making up the food parcels, and were really working all the hours that God sent, to be honest, about getting stuff out. And a lot of us, including myself, could actually work much more, you know, for virtually or, you know, or from home. So I think there was quite a distinction there, really. And I think one of the things that certainly talking to some of the people that were involved that came across was a lot of people saying, you know, even though we have been active in the community for very long times, we were astounded when knocking doors at the level of isolation, particularly in rural areas, the level of unknown poverty, that, you know, and again, in the 80s, we used to have door-to-door welfare benefit take-up campaigns. That hasn't happened any longer because of the fragmentation within communities. But that was coming out when people were actually going to the door and delivering food parcels. And the other then big issue that came out, and indeed just last week, I was talking to community activists working in East Belfast, where she was saying, yeah, and we really need to get community strategies around domestic violence, the position of women in those areas. And then the other thing that actually, you know, I suppose, and I put my hands up and say, I didn't think about it, was some of the people, the stories from some of the, like the Northwest Migrants Forum, people working with minority ethnic communities and saying, yeah, but it is that, it's in putting together food parcels, do people think what Muslim families would need in those parcels? Just, you know, the not thinking through things. So those sort of issues, and I suppose the last one I'd mention, apart from burnout, which I think is a real issue at the moment, is Northern Ireland showed the good and the bad of our current situation. The good side, actually, is we saw quite a lot of intra-community cooperation. You know, and, you know, a group in Dungannon making PPE equipment, giving it to a group in a loyalist community in Portadown that they wouldn't have had contact before. But the bad side, and mainly coming from some politicians, was raising suspicion about, you know, getting the credibility for doing the food parcels. So that being injected a bit in the situation as well. You're on mute now, Nuala.
I was trying not to interrupt you when you were speaking. Thanks for that. That was really concise presentation, and it gives a very quick flavour of what you've been dealing with in the North, and it has a slightly different edge, I would think, to what was in the South, but very similar trends as well. Martin, we were wondering if you would tell us a little bit to help to put us in the picture about what's happening in terms of more, maybe you might call them global issues, but particularly looking at maybe the impact of Brexit and how that has impacted on the work to try and bring about social change during and also peace building during COVID in particular. And I might just add to that I know some of us have been in conversations with you over the last year and a half in relation to this, but it strikes me that there is a dearth of information in the South, but for a lot of people, about what's actually happening there and what some of the real implications of COVID are, apart from what you might hear in the news.
I think just before I get into the Brexit stuff, I suppose one of the other things to add to Avila's points, really, the whole experience, I suppose, here in terms of the community response to COVID reinforced the importance of adequate support for the community involved, the community sector, because in particular it was the community sector that was there and that had the networks and that the government was often actually relying upon. And so one of the things we did, and I'll put some more things up in the chat, was we brought sort of community groups together to meet with government and to articulate some of the concerns that people had. We did find a bit of more of a willingness and an openness on the part of government to listen. I think there is a bit more of a sense now that there's been a retreat from that, but similarly with funders, more flexibility during COVID, some much more trust, much more flexibility, much less bureaucracy, people moving more quickly, and now again potentially a bit of a retreat from that. But on the broader issue of Brexit, and as you say, I think there's a lot of kind of talk about all of this, but maybe not just so much understanding. But essentially, the Good Friday Agreement made the border largely irrelevant in the situation here. Brexit, of course, makes that border very relevant again, not just in practical terms about free movement of goods and people, but also in people's heads. And so what you've seen over the last year or so are really a deterioration in relationships, I think, and a lot more tension between communities. And you've got a bit of a perfect storm, I suppose, where you have the change in demographics. You've got changes also going on in Britain, particularly in Scotland, and you've got the decisions made by the British government in relation to where its priorities lay vis-a-vis a hard Brexit as opposed to kind of maintaining the union, and all of that you saw then a number of months ago, quite significant street tensions with demonstrations, protests, and some violence. And I suppose in the midst of all of that, you would have also seen local community workers, youth workers, actually out on the streets trying to calm all of that. And in some occasions, actually creating human chains to keep largely crowds of young people apart. And again, what that has highlighted is the importance, for example, of youth work in local communities and the importance of community workers as people who know what's going on, people who also actually have connections across the community and who have been able to intervene to try to calm things. So I suppose all of this together has made for quite a challenging set of circumstances and time, and I suppose there'd be a strong sense among many of us that the UK government really shows a very scant regard for the sensitivity of the situation here, and embarks on a whole series of measures which and steps which are not at all sensitive to the fact that we had a conflict here, that there was a very long and painstaking work to try to manage that conflict. And I mean, I think, many of us anticipated that the particular hard form of Brexit that the government opted for, that would cause these problems. but there's a huge amount of work going on by local community activists trying to manage that tension, while at the same time you have people who are quite set upon stirring it up and actually creating more tension than might need to be the case. So it's a kind of I think quite a difficult time for us, in that a lot of the gains that were made and that were being made have been put at risk. People are, I think, sometimes afraid now to be reaching out. We had a gathering, I think Avila was at it just a couple of weeks ago, of people working on both sides of the community here. And she can maybe say just at some stage just a little bit more about what the feelings were there, but a lot more fear, more anxiety, and some uncertainty. And of course, Brexit has, I think, put a lot more momentum behind the argument about the future constitutional arrangements on and between these islands. And that discussion in and of itself, insofar as it happens, has a very binary, polarizing flavour at the minute. And again, I think we all probably need to do more to make that less polarizing, and to make it less binary, and to try to have many more conversations, both in the north but also in the south, because it's not a conversation that's going to go away, and the demographics and other changes that are taking place just mean that it's probably something that needs to be managed rather than something which can be put away. So I'll stop there, Nuala. That's a bit rambly, but hopefully it gives a bit of a flavour, and hopefully we'll have a chance for questions as well.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks, Avila. And just before I go to Paul, who I'm going to ask if he has any response to that, but also from his own experience. But just to say, I think that you have both highlighted, actually, as you've said yourselves, both the positive and the negative that happened during it, but also some very worrying trends, I think, that we all need to take note of, because I think there are probably some trends that are similar as well in the Republic. But one of them in particular is the fact that governments and funders were showing flexibility and were willing to kind of work with groups and hear and listen to groups, which is what we did here earlier as well during the plenary. But there's a bit of a retreat from that. So I think there's a question maybe that we need to think about is, what do we do about that? How can we address that? And how can we address it in terms of an all-island approach, as well as in our own spaces and places as well? The other point I think, Martin, that you're making too, is that the challenging times for us all when it's going back, but the fear that's got into people, the fear both from the pandemic, because I think that engendered a lot of fear, but also the fear from, just not wanting to offend, going back to that old, whatever you would call it, that people don't want to be hurtful to anybody else, but at the same time, won't push out the boat a little bit in terms of trying to broach conversations and so on. And yet at the same time, we can see some quite courageous conversations going on. And I think this is probably, maybe if Avila tells us a little bit about the session the other night, that might be useful. Before I do that, maybe just if I could ask Paul, would you like to respond maybe a little bit to what you've heard, but also based on your own experience from the Intercultural Forum, perhaps as an example, or even on a cross-border basis, any work that you've been doing in the Northwest as well?
Thanks, Nuala. Thanks, Avila and Martin. Yeah, lots of what you were saying, I was immediately feeling, don't nod your head too much, because you're supposed to be saying something original, because most of what you said I could have some connection with, or some echo from my experience both in Donegal and around some of the border counties. I suppose a few things I would say. I think one of the things that struck me at the time, and you touched on it there, Avila, about the challenge to the community and voluntary sector. What I found happening as I ended up becoming the community coordinator for this part of Donegal, in terms of coordinating the volunteer response, and a member of the community response forum at county level, that immediately there was a disconnect at grassroots level, that many community organizations weren't as connected as they thought they were. were disconnected, as their annual reports might have suggested. And there was a challenge there, and part of that was about the people that we were challenged in connecting with were the most marginalized people. It was the door that you had never knocked on, and you discover what was behind that door was a story that you weren't aware of, whether that was about poverty, disadvantage, whether that was about multi-occupation, whether it was about mental health issues. So there was a challenge there, I think, that the community organizations, some really had to address, and that's still ongoing. The other disconnect I think that happened was that the response forum, which was chaired and managed by the local authority in all cases in the south, immediately one of the barriers that came up was the participation of organizations like the Islamic Association, which we argued for and lost the argument, brought the argument back up again and finally won it. But it was like, oh no, we've enough faith groups now, thank you very much. We're in the midst of a crisis, you know. So there was a sort of some of the old fault lines were still there. Some of the reluctances or the hesitancies were still there. And I suppose we all know this, that what COVID did was it shone a light on the inequalities and on the issues and the fault lines in our communities that were already there pre-COVID. I suppose a few things I would say. I suppose one of the things that I've heard lots of people talk about, and I feel I've heard people echo, is that really what COVID has thrown up are all of those inequalities that we know about. And Mike was talking about the Dalgate and Whitehead, their social determinants of health, that really, if everyone wanted living evidence of the valuable truth of that sort of approach, it's what we've experienced in the past 18 months. And it's sort of, it's been a confirmation of what a lot of organizations like ourselves that we've all been involved in this sort of work have been arguing for many years. I would also say that I think at local level, there were impacts like the peace program, and I know I'm looking over at Stuart there. He and I have been at a number of things together around the peace program and Peace 4, and how the work that we were doing across the border with organizations came to a close, came to an end. And on one hand, it showed you that the COVID pandemic was no respecter of European programs, let alone local initiatives, but it also showed how fragile the sorts of connections that we're trying to go on are, that when a piece of funding is pulled or a pandemic issue arises, that work is immediately pigeonholed. And it makes me suggest that really one of the things we're missing are the sorts of forums between organizations like those that I work for or those I volunteer with across the border. You know, we shouldn't just need a little bit of peace money to meet and talk, to share what our experiences are. And I think we've had a commonality of experience in the past 18 months that might warrant further discussions. But also what's maybe being lost is something that Martin was alluding to, and that was the tensions and the difficulties that have arisen in the last 12 to 18 months around economic issues, around the Brexit issues. You mentioned the Northwest Migrants Forum, Avila. You know, even issues like the looking for permits for non-Irish, non-EU passport holders to be able to come and work. If you're living in border Donegal, you're working in a healthcare facility or a care facility in Derry, you're going to have to produce and get a permit to be able to cross that border and work. Those sorts of things were sort of invisible to some degree in the recent past, and that's no longer the case. What else would I say? I suppose I would say that there is a need maybe to consider not just at grassroots sort of level, at community organization level, but if we're talking to organizations like Community Work Ireland, maybe there is a responsibility to look at trying to establish some of those dialogues and those forums to continue the conversation that we're hearing today. I think the cuts that happened in the South from 2009 onwards and the impact that had on community organizations has weakened our voices, but it's also broken down the networks that we were used to. And some of us who are old enough to remember what we were doing maybe in the early 2000s, that became increasingly difficult. And it can't be resourced by drops of money every 5 or 7 years from things like peace. It actually has to be built from the grassroots back up again. And maybe that's a job that we could be saying and projecting up to Community Work Ireland organises this event. And you know, to Avila and Martin and some of the work that you've been involved in, to really try and reconnect those conversations outside of peace programs, outside of our response solely to a pandemic, but really to looking at how can we build equality and human rights across the border and across the island. That's all. I have loads of other notes and there's no more time, Nuala, so I'll leave it at that.
That's very good. Okay, Paul, thanks very much. I think you've hit on quite a few points there that relate very much to what both Avila and Martin have been saying. And maybe Avila, and I think you're also feeding very well into the need to identify a priority for us for this particular workshop as well. I think it's starting to formulate more clearly. Avila, maybe just before we go on and open it out to others, do you want to say a word about the forum that Martin was talking about the other night, or is that relevant at this stage?
Well, I think Martin actually has summed up a lot of the things that were being said there, that people were worried that tensions were ratcheting up. I think we've seen it for both COVID and actually current tensions in Northern Ireland, just the impact of social media. And that a very small number of people can actually create a narrative that then becomes almost the normative narrative, And I think we're much more conscious of that now, perhaps, than we were, or certainly that I myself proclaimed Luddite about 2 or 3 years ago, in terms of just the power of that. And it's interesting, actually, one of the things that we've actually been noticing and tracking to an extent is actually some of the sort of the right-wing social media narrative that's edging into Northern Ireland is coming from the south more than it is actually coming from the UK. It comes from the UK a bit, but actually southern groups are actually having an impact. But the other thing that came across actually from a number of people was the importance of us protecting the space for people who are challenging their own community. And again, the trolling and stuff through the internet is actually hanging some of those people out to dry. And we've seen a number of examples of that in the recent past.
Okay. Thanks, Avila. It kind of brings to mind some of the stuff that was happening in relation to the direct provision centres here as well, where there was a need to protect the communities who were supporting some of the migrants who were seeking protection against the kind of far right, who were very active in terms of engendering hostilities and so on as well. So I think that rings another bell. Is there anybody who would like to come back on any of the points that either Martin, Avila, or Paul have been making? And I see Liam Medlin has joined us there. Liam, you're welcome. I knew you had some difficulty earlier on. Anybody like to comment on it? I don't know. Anna Clark, yeah? Sorry.
Sorry, yeah, I did have a point, but I think somebody else had already started. I'm quite happy to wait.
I think Liam was going to come in there. I think, Liam, were you?
I was, very briefly, and Nuala, sincere apologies. I've had awful technical difficulties here because I'm in a shared office. So
yeah, you had said that on a text, all right. Yeah.
I'm a wee bit limited in what I can say, but it's lovely to be here. And
Okay.
I see my colleague Georgina is here too, and we're both teaching on the TU Dublin Community Development and Youth Work degree programme.
Okay.
And believe it or not, the group of students I met this morning, the first thing they asked me is, Liam, are we going to Belfast again this year for our visit? Because we had a really nice visit to the markets community in Belfast. But I suppose the comments I would make are really around the teaching of the discipline and the practice of community development and community work on an all-island basis. And it's nice to be part of that. With the Ulster University course is the other endorsed programme, along with Maynooth University and Blanchardstown. And the more of these programmes that meet these requirements for the discipline of community development and community work, the better. That's really, so the next generation of community workers. And it's great actually to see Paul there from Falcara. I was up there doing the research, and it was so nice to see the community work in Donegal that's happening on the ground and the issues for the communities there, the isolation, the almost east-west shift in the county, as well. That was something came up with the isolation that people felt. That was before the pandemic, and climate change is also having impacts as well. Believe it or not, there was a terrible flooding at the time in Ishone. So yeah, those are just comments, the initial comments, and great to see Anna here as well, whom I've met before as well. So that's all for me.
Thanks, Liam. So we'll go to Anna at that point then. Anna, you were just about to come in there too.
Yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, Liam, lovely to see you as well. In many respects, I Liam has kind of sort of preempted some of the key points that I was going to highlight. And I put into the chat, you know, a kind of resounding endorsement for everything that Avila kind of kicked off with, because in terms of the conversations that I've been involved in over the last 18 months, all of those things have been really kind of, you know, top priorities, wholly pertinent to the communities that have been working away on the ground. And one of the things that came to my attention just recently was that in one particular council area here in the north, where there was an infrastructure of community development officers coming from different disciplines, but who were coordinating some of those community groups on the ground, because they weren't connected. And I was really interested in the point, I think it was I've lost him now, he's moved around on my, Paul was saying the people weren't as connected as we thought we were. And actually one of the things that came to light in this council area was that the community groups weren't as connected as one might have thought they would have been either. And there was a lot of fragmentation for a variety of reasons, some of which was politically motivated in that it suited local elected representatives to keep them from connecting with each other. But what I wanted to say was, you'd mentioned burnout, Avila, and obviously that was a huge thing in terms of, you know, people's energies and efforts. But in this council area, I discovered just in the last week that a lot of the council officers, staff who were involved in supporting those community groups had also left their posts. And they were permanent, full-time council employees, and their posts were being filled by agency staff who were coming in with no knowledge specifically of community development or community work. And that's where, I mean, it kind of links back to what Liam was saying as well. I think it is absolutely critical that out of these discussions, if nothing else, that point about creating and protecting a space for people involved in community work, working with communities and supporting the development of knowledge, learning, skills for people working in this field is fundamental, because it is really being eroded. And for all the things that we've been talking about today, it's even more pertinent that is protected, and that we do what we can, create the space for the dialogue, but also create the space for the protection of the field of practice that is community work as well. And I think for me, that's because I've been involved in an All Ireland piece of work with the All Ireland endorsement body and Community Work Ireland, and I do have concerns about how community work is supported as a field of work in the north, and I think there's a real disparity that we need to create that protection around. And I'll stop there, sorry.
No, you're okay. Thanks, Anna. I think it's good because it's kind of reinforcing some of the points that have already been made, and again can feed into, I think, a priority as well. Anybody else like to make a comment or respond to anything that either Martin, Avila or Paul have said? Yeah, Martin, it's nothing. You're on mute, Martin.
I think that's me now.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. No, I wanted to echo a lot of what Avila and Martin O'Brien had said, and just to add to it a little with regards to what I'm experiencing out and about in the community there at the moment. And one of the main things is the battle that's taking place within the pool community around the Northern Ireland protocols. And you know, last night I was up in Antrim, and there's posters up on the wall, the Good Friday Agreement's dead. So there's a mentality that's coming through from a generation not of my age, that the Good Friday Agreement was torn up by the people that actually were supporting the peace process after the term of the Good Friday Agreement, the European Union, with regards to what had taken place. For years, you know, for 30 years, I've been working around this legacy of violent conflict and peace building. And I have seen things going back 20 years with regards to people's feelings about what's going on out and about. And they're coming on top of the fear that was generated with regards to the virus itself. The level of trust has almost hit zero out and about in the community. And with what Avila had said about the social media platforms, where people are mainly getting their information from nowadays, it's like wildfire. It just goes zoom through the community. And there's battles that are going on within the pool community at the moment between people who were supporters of the Good Friday Agreement, people who actually committed to it fully, and another generation that's now jumping on the back of the Northern Ireland Protocol to try to tear the Good Friday Agreement down. I know with working with people that there has been people trying to pressurize paramilitary organizations to become more violently involved in the argument about the protocol itself. So there is big difficulties, and there's lots of people who are working extremely hard and getting burned out and need to be supported, genuine people. But it's also the case that, and I've said this before, we need to go back to creating the spaces to allow people to come in and voice their opinions and have those arguments in a safe space, rather than on social media platforms where it's just labeling and targeting and try to demonize people of a different opinion. So we have more work to do today than what we have had to do for 15 years. I'll pause there.
Dear.
It's not a very hopeful sight.
No, but it's probably accurate, and I think the combination of both what had been there in terms of peace building and the attempt to destroy a lot of that, but also the COVID and the fear that it engendered, it all worked together. Sorry, Martin, go ahead.
One final thing, Nuala.
Yeah.
For the past 10 years, I've been working on a north-south basis with regards to Irish history and bringing young loyalist bondsmen down to Dublin to meet with people in Dublin, to go into Glasnevin Cemetery, to visit the Republican plant respectfully. Those same young men were leaving Dublin with a different impression of the people in the south. But that has almost been wiped out again. We're like back to square one with all of that. And I just want to emphasize again that there is so much more work that needs to be done today than what has been done for a while.
I think it reinforces the point too, Martin, that none of this work is short term. It really is a long, slow process, as was indeed the struggle for civil and human rights and equality, and that we will just have to continue. And I think it's evident enough from the discussions today that there is a commitment and a will to do that. So we just need to try and think about what maybe one or two steps that we can do as well. Is there anybody else would like to come in on this? I'm conscious of like Noel Wardock there in the inner city in Dublin, or Mary Connors working with the traveller population. Would you like to say anything about some of the impacts that you see, any similarities? I'm conscious of the social media work in relation to travellers, for example, and not work, but the impact of that kind of negative stuff that's been circulated. But particularly in terms of vaccination and so on, but on much broader issues as well, and being very divisive amongst the community too, so itself. I don't know, Noel or Mary, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, I think you've almost said it there for me. I think
Sorry.
particularly with the you're fine. But particularly with the social media and not just the divide between the settled community and the travelling community, but it was a very uphill battle. The social media was spread a lot of fear and anxiety amongst and misinformation amongst the travelling community, and made the work of kind of promoting vaccinations and things very difficult as well. I'm mostly just listening now because it's kind of cross-border things quite new to me, but yeah.
But maybe just one point I might make, because I forgot to introduce myself. I'm working for Pavy Point Traveller and Roma Centre at the moment, and one of the issues there that has been very clear is that the level of organisation around traveller issues in the north is very, very low. It's challenged in the south, but there are primary healthcare projects throughout the country and so on. And they came to the fore really when it came to dealing with the pandemic, and it just showed you the importance of that infrastructure, as people have been saying already, but the need to support it and fund it and there are some fears that that's being dismantled at the moment. I think you would have heard that from Ronnie's input earlier on. Noel, sorry, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, thanks very much, Nuala. I mean, I decided to join this workshop, this Group 7 today, on the All Ireland basis, just as I think Mary just said there, as a listening exercise really for myself, and to hear, I suppose, a new angle on things. I mean, the other groups looked extremely interesting, so it's always hard to choose which one.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with a lot of the issues in the sense that it's part of, it's the day job and all of that. But this would be the All Ireland side, and hearing colleagues speak there from Northern Ireland is a big eye opener, and I don't recall having any other opportunity, to be honest. And I'm working on this job for the last 7 years nearly, to meet with or engage with colleagues from the north and look at things on an all island basis. This is the first time, as I say, so I jumped at the opportunity, and I'm delighted to hear colleagues there speak and give updates, whether in the north or in the border counties from the Republic. So it's been really, really interesting, if a bit disconcerting, I suppose, to hear some of the feedback about the extra challenges over and above COVID, which obviously are specific to the north, and sectarian tensions and Brexit and all of this, just completely adding to the difficulties of the situation. And then to hear, Good Friday Agreement today, all this sort of stuff, it's really, really worrying, but really important. So I mean, I'm just interested to know what and if any, maybe there's not, opportunities for engagement and dialogue and discussion and sharing of experiences, and that we're just doing here. But I'd be really interested, because ultimately for all of us, I mean, poverty and social exclusion transcends borders and communities and religions and all that. And for all of us, I suppose it's a massive frustration that very often what the similarities we have in communities that are disadvantaged are far, far, far greater than those issues that divide them. And it's always terrible. I remember seeing some footage, I don't know, it was a few months back, from the north, and watching youths on either side lobbing bricks and stuff at each other, and you just knew, from someone from the south not particularly familiar with the north in detail, knew that those young people throwing stuff at each other were all from disadvantaged communities on either side of the divide. And it was sort of so stressful, like, just to see that they have so much more in common. And it's, the enemy is probably the wrong word, but it's not each other. It's it's a society that excludes them and keeps them in disadvantage. But just from the point of view of Dublin City, I mean, I work in the University of Dublin City, and we have our challenges there as well, which is the absolutely rapidly changing demographics of the city, from nearly 95% homogenous white Irish to now the communities that we work with are 30, 40, 50, and in some cases, some of the smaller communities, 60% new communities, where white Irish will be in a minority. So that brings with it a very changing dynamic and tensions, huge opportunities that we try to harness, of course, but equally all sort of tensions. And I think the guys have been talking about how well connected with the communities are we that we're supposed to be working with. And I raise this point down here all the time. We're probably very well connected with traditional white Irish social housing flat complex communities in Dublin's inner city. But how connected are we with the new communities, which are not some tiny little community? They're, as I say, in some areas the majority. So all these similar challenges, and then like we have a big Roma project. There's a big Roma community in the northeast inner city in Dublin, and the whole issue around vaccination and social media and all of that. A huge factor there, because vaccination is virtually at 0% within the Roma community. So yeah, look, it's been a fascinating listen to colleagues, Nuala, and really appreciate the opportunity to engage for the first time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Noel, thanks very much for that. It just strikes me how much longer we need for this conversation, really, but I'm really conscious of time. We have about 9 minutes left. We do have to identify a challenge. I'm just conscious too that maybe Anne, I see you put your hand up, Liam, but also Anne, I don't know if you want to say anything at all before we move to the next stage, or Stuart. If you don't, that's fine, but if you do want to say anything, just give you a moment to.
Yeah. Liam, go on ahead, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
No,
I'm really...
sorry. If I could just let Anne in first and then Liam, because just Anne hasn't spoken.
Liam's going to be going, is he?
Yeah, I just had to leave. Sorry.
Oh, right. Okay. Really sorry, Liam. I didn't realise that. Yeah.
That's
sorry
okay,
about that. I thought you wanted to come in, and I just wanted to get others in first. Okay, Liam. Bye, and thanks for joining even for that period. Anne?
So I suppose I would just reiterate a lot of what was said. What Paul was saying about the cooperation is very interesting. We've been doing work on education for the Shared Island Unit And one of the fellas I was talking to said, you know, it's sort of politicized north-south cooperation. Because like, we talk to Sweden, we're talking to Wales, we're talking to Scotland. It's actually ridiculous that we're not talking to the north. Like nothing to do with politics or anything, but just talking and learning and helping. We're talking to all these other countries. And I says, is it sort of a Brexit thing? And he was like, no, it's never been the way, just because of how things are. And he was like, there's no reason for it. Everybody would benefit. They're talking to the other constituent parts of the UK. So really there's no, you know, big logic in it. Somebody was telling me about a group of sort of education stakeholders, can't remember the unions, whoever, they all meet. A couple of European countries, and Scotland are hugely active in it, and the North isn't in it. You know, it just doesn't make sense. And the likes of health, you know, some of the politicians are talking about pulling out of all island things. I don't think anybody cares, no matter their background, if they have a child that needs a heart operation, if they go to Liverpool or Dublin. You know, nobody is benefiting from that. I just think it's these day-to-day things and important things, and cooperation is going to help everybody there, especially in border areas, but everybody's going to benefit. And also the social media thing, I think is huge. And maybe Martin, you'll sort of answer this. I wonder, you see it on Twitter and you hear it then on BBC News talking about such and such says this. How reflective actually is it of society? I don't think it is. And I think the likes of them signs you see about the Good Friday Agreement being dead, I don't know if I'm being optimistic or I'm being ignorant. I hope that it's not that reflective of our wide society in the North.
Okay, Martin, is that for Martin O'Brien or Martin Snodden you're asking?
Martin Snodden and whoever.
Okay, so Martin, a very quick response, and then it maybe just move to the next bit. And if Stuart wants to come in.
Sorry, I shouldn't be asking more questions.
No, that's okay, you're fine, yeah. It's a good question.
It is a good question, and it needs a good response in terms of, I have seen more people come out and saying that the Good Friday Agreement's dead than what I would ever imagined. People, church-going people who were never involved in the conflict in the first place, are actually starting to make these statements. And some of them because they've been impacted by the protocol itself, but they're actually saying it, they're talking about it, and it's real. I'm sorry, it's real. Needs to be challenged.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay, thanks. And Stuart, do you want to add anything, or?
Yeah, I just agree with Martin Snodden. And we live right on the border, literally about 8 miles from Londonderry, and it basically we can feel, you know, you'll feel the tension starting to build in terms of the reaction to the protocol. But really, what I was going to go to is probably to the next point of it, and that's it, the fact that society seems to come out of COVID with two distinct groups: those that have and those that don't have. And I think this really, what looking forward, we need to look at the people that don't have and what can be put in place for them. You know, we have all the, well, we did have forums. There is still forums there where people can come together, and it's how we share those forums out to a wider scale of the population. It's okay probably for community people that can reach for phones and talk to somebody else or whatever, but it's identifying those that have lost out of COVID. I suppose, unfortunately, maybe some people have gained out of it. And I think that the ones at the bottom are probably what we need to look at.
Okay, well, I think that's a very useful point, Stuart, to have finished that round on. And if we have now about maybe 4 or 5 minutes to try and work to an option that we want to put forward for a kind of a key priority for action. I just having heard everybody, one of the big gaps is that it's just exactly what Stuart was saying, the difference between working with the people who are the most marginalised, and people have all said, I think Avila and Paul and Martin, about the people who are so marginalised that their voices hadn't even been heard, and the surprise of community workers when they started to go around the doors, the same in the inner city, whatever, to hear that, you know, what the different sets of issues were that they were facing. So one is that lack of connectivity, I think we probably need to address. And then the other one I think that I've heard quite a bit of as well, and that lack of connectivity is both within communities and it's across communities, and it's north and south as well. And so we might need to think about something around that. And then the other one then is the need to build kind of information and to kind of prevent the polarizing and so on, and to encourage spaces for conversations, for connecting with people, and also to support the learning and knowledge and the community work, human rights and equality kind of conversations and dialogue that we would have been thinking of. Martin, I think of you trying to encourage those conversations during particularly difficult times during the Troubles, and the need almost for some of that again to start rebuilding, some of it based on standards for good practice and so on. So I don't know if anybody wants to grapple with trying to get that into one priority, or maybe one and a sub priority. Is there any thoughts on what we might propose from this particular group? And it is about the all island basis. It seems to me that about the need for the connectivity on an all island basis is really important, creating spaces for that, creating spaces for exposure trips, even to put them at a very basic level, and also maybe for a little bit more flexibility from funders, or indeed not even rely on funders, but to think about relying on ourselves and our own resourcing of trying to do some of that as well, a bit of both maybe. Anyway, any thoughts on what we might put in as our key action that we have to identify as our priority action for the sector, north and south?
Well, I think you've summed it up fairly well, to be quite honest. The space for these discussions, and sometimes I get really frustrated, because I think, you know, both north and south, but particularly the north, we're great for putting the constitutional cart before the horse. In other words, we need space to sort of say, look, what sort of society do we want, irrespective of where the borders run, or what the constitutional framing will be, in terms of social justice and rights, and conscious about, you know, the Charter of Rights was in the Good Friday Agreement. It hasn't been even looked at, and that was for the island of Ireland. And then the second question is, and how best in terms of governance can that actually be delivered? You know, so, you know, and I'm also very conscious that, you know, all the sort of polling, and okay, we don't necessarily trust polling, suggests that there's still a large proportion of people that are either don't know, uncertain in Northern Ireland about the constitutional framework for the future. So I think we need the space to do that. But within that, I think we also need to be very aware, and I think particularly, and I grew up in Dublin, particularly from the south, of the constraints that people are operating within. So taking Martin Snodden's point, a very accurate description of what's going on at the moment in the PUL community, the constraints there actually are that the blame has to be in either the EU or the Republic of Ireland, because they can't sort of blame the UK government, despite the fact it was the UK government that actually negotiated it. And similarly, in the south of Ireland, the constraints are very much, well, we have our system, and as Mike said earlier, which is extremely centralized, or I think it might have been the minister said it, and we really can't get our head around how we could have a different system that actually might be federal, or, you know, give completely different sort of constitutional options. So to be conscious about those constraints, I think is really important.
Okay, so again, it's back to create space for discussion. Sorry, Georgina, you try.
I was going to say, just as it's my role to put our synopsis of our call for action into the JAM board, what would it be fair, summarising the notes that I have, to say that we want to examine frameworks for dialogue, and under 3 distinct headings: people, around that connectivity, how do we connect with people, again, the communities that were very marginalized, that didn't engage before, the places that we do it, again, is it, you know, local town halls, exchanges, online, and then look at the creators of space, of supporting people who are trying to build that dialogue. And again, in that place that was brought up by Anna and Liam around the protection of and the support of community workers. Would that be a fair synopsis or a fair call to action? I don't know if I've tried to just pull everything in together, if that works.
Anybody, any other thoughts on that? But yeah, that's useful there.
I mean, I think the question is whether you want a kind of one-line slogan or not. And if you do, the one-line slogan is more space for connection and conversation across the island, and inside the different parts of it. I mean, that's that seems to me, so people need to learn more about each other.
Yeah.
People, the kind of stuff that Martin Snodden was talking about, that's what we need more of. You know, once this is a time of uncertainty, a time of change. Change is going to happen, and our job is to work out how best to manage it and how to minimize the damage. It seems to me we can't stop the change. The change is coming. And, you know, I just on Martin's point about the agreement, I mean, I think that is a scary thing, that more and more people are saying, you know, the Good Friday Agreement's the source of all our woes here. The Good Friday Agreement's over. I mean, that's a narrative. It's a dominant narrative. It's a narrative that's gaining power. One of the reasons why it's gaining power is because other people aren't challenging it. And people aren't actually reminding people that the Good Friday Agreement has a protection clause in it, which says that if things do change, then there's a responsibility to protect the identities of everybody and to respect those. So there's an overemphasis on the border poll and an underemphasis on the fact that if there is a change, there are protections in the Good Friday Agreement for unionists. It seems to me that's underplayed, underexposed, underdiscussed, and people might disagree with that, but you know, the Good Friday Agreement's really the best friend that unionists have. That seems to me to be, it's sad then that the dominant narrative is basically saying, and that there really isn't an alternative narrative coming from inside unionism in a public way about that. And that's part of the problem in my opinion. But I think that space for conversation, space for dialogue, space for exchange, space for learning across the island, because we are all going to have to learn how to deal with this problem, because Brexit, in my view, has taken the problem back out of the box, and so now we're all going to have to deal with that.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Martin. That's very helpful. And Paul, there you were wanting to come in.
I'm just going to say, I like Martin's abbreviation of the debate. The one thing I maybe would make a plea for would be that, as opposed Martin Snodden's point earlier on about creating safe spaces, it's creating places where that actual dialogue can take place. And I think there's a community work attachment or label to that. And I think that should be part of Martin's brief statement, but otherwise, I vote for Martin's statement.
I agree with that. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Okay, what have we got so far? We're saying, and are we asking Community Work Ireland to try and facilitate some of that? Is that what we're asking? So we're asking Community Work Ireland to help to facilitate or create more safe spaces for conversation, dialogue, discussion and exchange across the island, so that we can learn more about each other and about the issues that are faced because of COVID, Brexit, and what's the third one? There was a climate change, maybe. I don't know. Want to add that one to it or not? But that seems to be the intersecting one. Is that what we're talking about? There's many arms to it that you could put, but I think that creating the space will allow that to be kind of teased out a good bit more then as well.
I mean, I wonder, does that specifically get the point that Paul was making, which I think is an important one?
The community work
lens to this, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
so
I
Community
think
Work Ireland could be doing that for community workers. Couldn't
20 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, so Community Work Ireland to facilitate space for conversation, dialogue, learning using a community development perspective on the issues impacting communities across the island.
Yeah, in a post-COVID and in terms of the Good Friday Agreement and COVID.